criminal defense hero Don Hammond and little old me, Jeff Norman, a.k.a. Citizen Jeff. And it's, what is it, Monday after, shall we call it a volatile weekend? How was the weekend for you, Don?
My weekend was actually pretty good. I'm having trouble coping with the fact that it's June already. Since it seems like half the year we haven't been able to do our normal stuff, and now half the year is gone.
Yeah. And here in California, right when the restaurants and stores were opening after a long hiatus, we had what should have been a celebratory time ruined by a bunch of hooligans. Let's see if I can use enough words to irritate people. Thugs, terrorists, Neanderthals, losers. But before we get to that, why don't we talk about the latest in the George Floyd case? Because that's where it all started. One of the officers was charged with second-degree murder. This was the officer Chauvin, I guess it's pronounced to
it. It was originally third-degree murder. I'm not sure if that's changed.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I expected it might.
Yeah, that's why I have that on my mind, actually. So he was charged with third-degree murder, and then there's a second charge of manslaughter, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And so far, the three who were there, and according to some video that was released subsequent to the original one, played a somewhat active role in the incident. So let's start with the charges against Chauvin, or if you prefer, Chauvin. What is your assessment?
So the third-degree murder charge carries a maximum of 15 years. And I speculated before that we'd have to wait for, to look at what exactly Minnesota law says about that charge and when it's applicable. And as we start to look into the case law and the way that that charge has been interpreted, it looks like it's usually applied to situations where somebody's shooting into a crowd and kills somebody, where there are multiple potential victims rather than animus directed at a particular individual. So it doesn't really seem to apply here. And this links in also to what I was saying about having outside agencies handle the investigation and the prosecution. They did it right by not having the Minneapolis PD investigate their fellow officers, but they had the same county district attorney initially file these charges as the district attorney this officer has worked with for the last 19 years of his career. And certainly that is a problem. So last night, it appears that the governor of Minnesota appointed the state attorney general to now take over the prosecution, which is probably a very good call to avoid any actual or perceived buffoonery in this case.
Right. Now, isn't there a possibility that the federal government will also get involved?
It is possible the federal government will be involved if they think that it's not, being handled properly. Generally, a federal agency is not going to handle a state-level prosecution. It's possible the federal government could prosecute him for some sort of civil rights charge, but that would be unusual. The vast majority of the time in these police cases, we see them prosecuted at the state level. Also, we rather more frequently than many people would like, we see acquittals. So, we have to weigh that with a grain of salt also.
Okay, so there was an op-ed published in the Boston Globe this morning, written by Lawrence Tribe, one of my least favorite people, the activist professor scumbag. But sometimes he's right. And it was co-written by Albert Goines, who's a criminal defense attorney in Minnesota. And it seems to me the nub of their argument is the excerpt I selected there, which says anyone steeped in Minnesota law would recognize that the third-degree murder charge would likely be summarily dismissed for the ironic reason that Chauvin clearly aimed his acts at Floyd. What do you make of that, Don?
Well, that seems to be an interpretation that's consistent with other Minnesota defense attorneys that I've had contact with regarding this situation. I think, as I've mentioned before, I'm a member of the National Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers, as well as the National College for DUI Defense, both of which have very active email listservs. And there are, of course, Minnesota lawyers chiming in there with their opinions. And that seems entirely consistent that Minnesota state law would not generally apply a third-degree murder charge to these circumstances. And I mean, it's baffling to me that the county district attorney there wouldn't know that. It's weird that they would have chosen to charge something in a way that wouldn't hold up. That's certainly a problem.
Okay. Well, I think I understand what the point is here, but intuitively, which may not be the correct legal interpretation, but intuitively, it feels like it shouldn't be problematic. In other words, even though it may be that, let's see, what was the point I was trying to make again? I'm sorry, let me get that back. He clearly aimed his axe at Floyd. So it just seems like if it was aimed at Floyd, it seemed like you could also charge them for just acting recklessly. But I guess the argument here is that the jury would be properly instructed not to find a conviction if they think there was some intent to harm him?
I don't think that particular charge will make it to a jury. I think a good defense attorney would have it dismissed on its face because it's inapplicable to these facts. And then what I expect to happen is, before it even gets to that point, now that you have the state attorney general acting as the prosecutor in the case, I think that they'll file an amended complaint and charge him with a second-degree murder and keep the manslaughter charge. But I think they'll let that third-degree thing go. Right.
Well, I guess the conventional wisdom, and by that I mean people who maybe aren't well versed in the law, the theory was, well, you don't want to overcharge and then you won't get a conviction. But this is undercharging.
It looks like the lead count was undercharged, and then they added on this manslaughter count as something that may very well be applicable. And ultimately a jury would have both charges to look at if they all survive motions to dismiss and things like that, which seems to be the concern with the third degree charge, is that it won't even withstand a motion to dismiss because it's clearly inapplicable to these facts. It's one of those situations where legally the judge, a defense attorney would be saying, Judge, assume that everything they're saying is true. You apply this law to those facts, no jury can convict. So we're not going to take this charge to a jury. And then You're left with just the voluntary manslaughter charge. And that's, obviously a much lighter sentence. I think it carries up to 10 years, but generally you see a much lower sentence on that. And that's not going to be, many people think anyway, that is certainly not going to be appropriate to this case. And, let's not forget that when we saw the big riots back in '92, it was after the officers were acquitted, not after a video came out of cops doing bad things. So what we're seeing now on the streets may be the tip of the iceberg if a year from now we see an acquittal because this thing was, not properly handled.
Okay. So somebody is wanting to join our broadcast, and I don't know if it's about this particular topic. Kevin, are you there?
Citizen Jeff, I am. How you doing?
Good, thank you. Don Hammond, say hi to Kevin and vice versa.
Yes, sir. Hello, Kevin. Welcome.
Hey, Don, how you doing? Love the show so far. This is great. Learning a lot. Now, the law is not my specialty. I thought maybe we were going to talk about some of the protest stuff that you and I have been monitoring this weekend, but
yeah, we can get to that. In fact, maybe now is the time for that. What do you think, Don? Is there anything else you wanted to say? Oh, I know. I wanted to ask you, what about the other three officers? Should they be charged? Again, intuitively, it seems that if they were fired and if the lead officer was committing third or second degree murder and they were holding them down or some such thing, it seems like they've got to be charged with something. That's the layman's assumption. What do you think?
But Jeff, don't snitches get stitches?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a much closer call with regard to those other officers. I mean, I think that they all should have, backed off. The guy's already handcuffed. There's no reason to be applying any amount of force to him at that point. He's not a threat to them. They could all stand up and back off and let him flail around on the ground and try to resist if that's what he wants to do. There's no reason to be applying any level of force. Now, whether they would be susceptible to a homicide type charge, that seems a little steep to me. Maybe it's some sort of accomplice. Again, it's an interpretation of Minnesota law. California has eliminated what they call the felony murder rule, which would apply to people who are engaged in some sort of felony, and then their co-crimey kills somebody in the process, and then everybody gets charged with the murder. That doesn't fly in California anymore. I'm not sure if Minnesota has those types of laws, but firstly, there would have to be a predicate felony, which is also maybe a stretch. I mean, maybe they're charged with assault. Maybe they're civilly liable for some civil rights violations. I'm not sure that any of them is doing any
driving the getaway car.
Charges.
I'm sorry to talk over you. I was saying at least something akin to driving the getaway car at a bank robbery or something, right? I mean, how can it be nothing?
Yeah, well, so one question is, I mean, we want to hold police officers to a higher standard, but legally there are very few laws that actually apply differently to police officers than to the average person. Now, if I'm holding somebody down so that you can kill them, clearly I'm going to be liable for that. But if I'm standing there on the street watching you kill somebody, I have no legal duty to intervene. I think these officers absolutely, without a doubt, had a moral duty to tell their buddy, hey, get off of him. This is unnecessary, especially at the point where he stopped moving. He became non-responsive. Like, what are we doing here? Please stop. We got this. There's a guy with a knee in his back. There's a guy holding down his feet. We don't need somebody on his neck to control this situation. Get off of him. Absolutely, morally, they should have said that. Legally, it's a tougher question as to whether that can support a criminal charge under Minnesota's criminal codes.
Right. All right. Well, this is a good point to segue into the protests, because I think one of the things that the protesters are clamoring for is for them to be arrested. And I'm the last person to want to give in to public opinion when it's, uninformed bunch of crybabies or whatever, just ignorantly spewing things. But if they're right, and it would quell disturbances, that's a pretty strong combination. So the National Guard has been called in various cities, and some people are saying, well, we don't like this militaristic approach. Others are saying, well, geez, they were called in too late. And I know, Don, you were upset by an incident. I don't remember where it was exactly. I think it was in Minnesota, where the National Guard went cruising down a street, and some neighbors were out in front of their house, and it was past curfew, and they got, I guess, shot with, was that paintballs?
Yeah, it looks like paintballs. I think it's an absolutely absurd situation where we have the government sending the National Guard down the street, ordering people into their homes, and then shooting at citizens who are on their own porch. I mean, we're trying to tell people that violence is not the answer, and that we need to all calm down. It's not a good look, and I think that it's morally and legally reprehensible for them to be shooting at people who are standing on their porch, videotaping them walking down the street. I cannot imagine a situation where that's justified. I mean,
All right,
if a video comes out and shows those people had guns, okay, game on.
All right, hang on one second, Kevin. We'll get you in. And Don, hang on too, so we can show the footage so people know what we're talking about. Kevin and Don, I'm not sure you'll be able to hear the audio, but this is more of a visual thing anyway.
No, there's more. Look at this. They just keep coming.
Go inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get in your house now! Let's go! Light him up! Go inside now! Get in the house!
Get in, get in, get in, get in, get in, get in. Get in.
Oh, God, that hurt.
Paintballs. Paintballs.
Actually, the audio was key there. Were you guys able to hear
Yeah,
that?
absolutely.
Don?
I did not hear it on the live feed here, but I've heard it before, so I understand that. So yeah, the officers, light them up, and then they start firing at people sitting on their porch. I think that's absolutely absurd.
It looks like a real training issue to me. I mean, in all the military, you have different occupational specialties. I mean, these guys could be 11 Bravo infantrymen, and a lot of them probably coming back from being deployed overseas, where you have a combat situation and applying some of those techniques here at home. It's not, which is obviously a very bad thing. It's one of the problems when you look at people like Chalmers Johnson, who had long worried and warned us that what we do overseas will eventually come home and be visited on the civilian population. Well, perhaps this is just some evidence of that.
Right. Well, it's hard to disagree about that incident, but overall, my sentiment is kind of the opposite of what you guys are expressing. I don't know if you gentlemen would agree or disagree with the general situation, which is that we are besieged by people who should be categorized as terrorists. And if we don't stand up to them and stand up to them powerfully, where does that leave us? Well, I can tell you where it leaves me in my neighborhood. My neighborhood was destroyed last night, and I couldn't get into any shops or restaurants or anything this morning. Everything's closed. These people have their businesses destroyed. The community now doesn't have access to goods and services. People are being terrorized on highways. And they just want to live their lives. It's one thing to object to what happened to George Floyd, but quite another thing to take it out on people who bear no culpability. Now, did you guys see again, I'm not sure where it was, but this is another National Guard situation. Let's see if we can just add this so we have some broader perspective. I believe this was also the National Guard. Now, watch this video. What happened was some guy was blocking a car, one of the favorite moves of these protesters. And what looked like a National Guardsman to me went over to pull him away from the car so that the driver, believe it or not, might be able to use the road for its intended purpose. And immediately, a bunch of onlookers started screaming at the guardsman to let him go, accusing him of taking the guy's car away from them. And you can tell from the audio and the video that they're like just a few feet away from the car, and the driver of the car, the owner of the car, is in it. Yet they think this guy is the owner of the car, and they're taking his car away, and they start yelling at the guardsman. And then after they pull him away, they immediately take their hands off him, and they get into their armored vehicle. And this guy who was standing in front of a car climbs on top of the armored vehicle, and then they drive away with the guy on it. And then the headline in the YouTube where I got this said that the National Guardsmen detained this guy. They never detained him. They just pulled him off the car and immediately let go of him. Tell me if I've described this fairly or not.
Some more, jump, boy. You can't take that man car. He ain't got his shorts. He ain't got his shorts. He got fake shorts. You don't want that car.
No, you don't.
What is this? His car?
It's his car, he said, I think.
And they're taking it from him? Why?
No idea.
Don't let go, bro. Don't let go. 4 ain't enough. 4 ain't enough. Don't let go. 4 ain't enough, bro. 4 ain't enough. Let him go. Don't let go.
Guys, why you gotta do this again? Why?
Hold on to that shit.
4 ain't enough.
Just let him go.
Yeah, make him get some more. Make him get some more. Come over here, bro. Watch out.
Let him go, man.
Put him on here. motherfuckers on one move. They can't even get up on
Let him go.
Don't let go. Don't let go. Four ain't enough. Four ain't enough.
And why the fuck y'all driving this car?
Whoa.
Why y'all driving this car? Get on that bitch! Get on that bitch! Get on that bitch! Your car! It's our car now!
Hit the gas then. Hit the gas then. Go ahead, bro.
All right, first of all, I want to check with you experts. Am I correct? Those are guardsmen? Can you tell from their uniforms?
They appear to be.
It's difficult to tell regular Army from guardsmen these days. They're all wearing, their battle dress uniform. And I don't know the unit designations on that vehicle, so I couldn't say with a degree of accuracy.
Well, I'm not aware of active duty being called in any place in the country.
Isn't there a thing called posse comitatus?
I'm
Yeah,
sure
right.
it's National Guard of some sort.
Right. And I don't want to bore our audience with our technical issues, but I just want to make sure, Don, you still could not hear the audio?
That's correct. I could not hear that.
Kevin, you could hear it?
I could hear it. Maybe
Okay.
it's because the way I came into the meeting, I'm considered more audience than you guys. So maybe that's has something to do with it.
All right. Bad guess, but
We can check that later.
all right. Anyway, so now there, whose side should we take on that one?
God, it's so hard because do you guys recall that famous picture shot by Eddie Adams in Vietnam where he's taking a picture of a Vietnamese general who's doing an execution in the street of a member of the Viet Cong?
I don't remember that now.
Okay, very I think even he won all kinds of awards for it. But even Eddie Adams said, if you understand, because of course it was decried across the globe, but Adams said if you knew the context of it, what had happened, what had made that general rage the way he had, the death of a friend, his family, and the raping and killing of the fellow's wife, of his friend's wife, that was something that wasn't there in the picture. No, we didn't get to see that. We didn't have that information available to us. So sometimes when we see a video or a picture, we're looking at it maybe in context or out of context. Although I got to say, Jeff, there's a lot of context with that video. I still don't know why the guy was jumping on the vehicle. But it looks like what we have is a situation where we are injecting the National Guard into a culture that they're completely unprepared for. These.
I mean, they're supposed to be available for emergencies, and what else are we going to do if there's not enough cops? The cops are outnumbered by the looters, right, Don?
So there are interagency agreements that are in effect that are actually being called on right now. I know some of the local South Bay police departments have been sending officers, as well as the county sheriff's department sending officers to assist with LAPD. Initially, the mayor of LA said that he didn't think they were going to need the National Guard. He sure changed his tune quickly on that after a couple of hours. But yeah, I mean, we need some additional force to be able to keep the peace. I mean, I certainly don't begrudge these people their right to protest, and I think that there's a protest-worthy issue here, that everybody should be treated appropriately by our government and by our police. But there's a limit to what a protest should be allowed to do. I mean, so similar to things that we were planning to talk about in our second segment today, protests and political speech are subject to reasonable time, place, and manners restrictions.
That's right. And it's gotten distorted. People aren't the standard has shifted, and people are talking about the First Amendment right to protest, but they actually do not have a First Amendment right to protest anywhere and any time they feel like it. And so even if they're not violent, they're not allowed to be taking over the streets, even if they do it in a non-violent way.
Which is what I saw even here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a city of 55,000 people, Saturday and Sunday. And it's interesting. What I'd found was there's a provocateur element in all of this. I'm sure there are a number of people that would like to peaceably assemble and protest and make their voices heard. But I don't know, gentlemen, I'd like to get your take on, do you see a agent provocateur element in this? And who knows where they're coming from and what their motivations might be. But I certainly sense that in what the footage that I've been seeing.
Good question. What do you think, Don?
Well, certainly in every crowd, there are people with different motives. Not everybody in there is aligned with everybody else in the group of people out on the streets. I've seen images of pallets of bricks pre-staged places. That's not the makings of a non-violent protest. That's somebody who's staged to do some violent stuff and really cause some problems. I'm also sensitive, though, to, it's not necessarily our business to tell people how to protest. People got upset with Kaepernick taking a knee, and that non-violent protest was so offensive to them. So people are going to try something else. And, our country has a history of violent protest going back, beyond the Boston Tea Party to address perceived grievances on behalf of whatever government is in power at the time. So, I'm not sure it's a tough, legally, I think there are problems with them breaking into places and setting fire to places. And after a point, there's certainly moral problems with that as well. But people need to be heard in a way that will make the officials listen. And there's a big question there. To me, it's a matter of line drawing, right? Certainly, they're allowed to go out there and protest and carry signs. If that leads to, and then there's chanting. Well, that's probably fine. Okay. Well, now they're blocking the street.
Not the Hare Krishnas are in big trouble.
At some point, you've got to draw the line, though, and recognize that they're hurting their own. They're tearing apart their own neighborhoods and, limiting their own access the next day to services and to, then you've got people out having to clean up their graffiti who don't deserve to be put in that position. This is such a multifaceted issue, and it really is a question of where we draw that line. I think we have to draw it somewhere short of lighting police cars on fire and assaulting people.
To answer Kevin's question, yeah, I think there are agent provocateurs in the crowd. And somebody asked in the comment section in our last podcast, so it's definitely on folks' mind. And I think the motivation is to make things miserable under Trump so that it happens on his watch and he can be blamed for it. I haven't heard a better theory as to what the motivation is. And I blame Black Lives Matter, even the peaceful aspect of that, for being strategically unwise. They're creating the opportunities. The more it happens, the more they should be blamed for continuing to use this method of influencing the public, because it just invites the destruction of neighborhoods. And, it may sound racist or it may sound insensitive, but I'm sorry, I think I'm fairly assessing what's happening to our country, and I'm taking the side of the people, and that includes everybody, blacks, whites, Asians. Everybody is suffering as a result of what these terrorists are doing.
Yeah, I think it's a little insensitive in that, yes, in the long run, we're seeing where it's not moving the cause forward. But getting back to the agent provocateur, this is classic right out of the 1971 anarchist cookbook. What you want to do is create these violence has a purpose. And Don, you had mentioned, we have a history of violent protest in this country. Well, sometimes violence works. Violence created the state of Israel. So it does have a place in politics and affairs of state. But I think what we see here is they are taking advantage of this opportunity. And these acts of violence, these acts of destruction, what they're really looking for is not the act itself, but the reaction from the government. And amazingly, and this is where, I didn't vote for Trump and I didn't vote for Clinton. I ended up doing a protest vote for Jill Stein, but it is possible that there is a emotional genius to Trump. And if that is what he's doing, is he's creating a high demand for control by kind of laying back. That's brilliant, because what you'd expect to see in these situations is a very heavy, lamb-fisted attempt to end the protests, end the violence. And the people can then, think back to 1968. In that turning, I'm kind of a believer in the whole first turning concept. Well, at that time, we had a low demand for control, but we had a high supply of it. So the students were getting beaten down by the National Guard. Fast forward to this time of the fourth turning, which we are in, according to Strauss and Howe, there is a high demand for control, but there is a low supply of it. And so that, I think, is playing out in the field right now. I'd say the interesting thing about having Antifa classified as a terrorist group, a domestic terrorist group, is it might give us an opportunity to target this network, pull in some of these people, and find out who's actually pulling the strings.
Well, that's certainly another whole show. Antifa being designated as a terrorist group could be another whole show in itself. In terms of Jeff's comments as to who the agent provocateurs are, I tend to lean the other way and believe that there are more right-wingers in the crowd stirring up violence in an effort to take away credibility from the more legitimate protesters, to make them appear to be more violent than they are, and cause problems on that front. So, and there's probably a mix. I think we're probably both right to some degree.
Have you taken a close look at the looters and arsonists who are having a picnic at Target? They look like right-wingers to you?
Well, I wasn't out there on the street with my camera like you were last night, Jeff, but from what I've seen, that some images that I've seen posted and stuff, it appears that there's at least some reason to believe that in some places there are people being, busted in from everybody. Problem.
The images on the internet is what I was referring to. I was not. Oh, look at this here. I'm getting an emergency alert on my phone. Curfew now 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. Thank you, Tara.
5 p.m. Boy, you better go and get some groceries after this.
I wish they'd give us a little more notice.
Yeah, if the store is open. Actually, earlier today, the city councilmen were sending out emails saying it's a 4 p.m. curfew. So now it's 5 p.m. All right. Before we bring Mike into the conversation, let's take a look at some footage from Brooklyn, New York. This was two patrol cars approaching some protesters who were blocking traffic, and the patrol cars slowed down, but eventually went through the car. I won't prejudice anybody's perception by over-explaining. You can watch for yourself. Hang on. I say the cops did exactly the right thing. You got to strike a balance. So they shouldn't be plowing through at 50 miles per hour, but they shouldn't have to stop either, especially when they're getting attacked. So the first car slowed down, went very slowly, but kept going. And if people don't get out of the way, too bad. Hello, Mike. Where are you from?
Hey guys, I'm from the States, from Chicago originally. Right now I'm living in Europe and I'm watching this thing from across the pond. So I joined in. Thank you guys for doing this, because it's really good to see some more information on the situation.
Europe is a big continent. You don't want to say specifically where? I promise we won't show up at the house without calling first.
I'm in Poland right now.
Oh,
Poland.
what city?
And just outside of Warsaw.
Oh yeah, okay. I
What's
was
your
in Krakow
address?
for a week a couple years ago.
I already am jealous of Mike because I think his microphone might be better than mine.
Way cooler than mine.
So do you want to ask a question or make a comment or just tell us how wonderful we are, Mike?
I was curious, at what point, I mean, like, first of all, has the United States faced a situation like this before? And at what point can governors start declaring martial law?
Don, I think that might be for you.
So every instance where any level of government has declared martial law, it has later been declared that that was inappropriate and unconstitutional. So it's very difficult to say where that line is, except to say that we have never reached it.
Well, what does it mean to declare martial law as compared to calling in the National Guard and then imposing curfews? What's the next step? What's the difference between that and martial law?
Well, having never experienced it, I'm not real sure. I mean, it would involve things like 24-hour curfews, everybody stay in their home, nobody's allowed out. Much like we saw with coronavirus pandemic lockdowns, except people were allowed to go out, obviously for food and for certain jobs and for all kinds of reasons. I think the exceptions almost swallowed the rule in that case. But martial law would be a complete lockdown, cops on every corner, or National Guard, government authorities on every corner, making sure nobody comes outside would be my interpretation of martial law. And I don't see us getting there. It's the areas where they have these curfews and where people, they're rolling down the street enforcing it, like we saw in that first video, I think are very small areas. I mean, I live technically in the city of Los Angeles, and a suburb, a portion of it called Harbor City, and I don't see anything unusual near me. My wife was out earlier and said that she tried to go to a couple of like CVS type drugstores down closer to Gardena, and they were closed, but the one close to us was open. So, I think martial law is more of a widespread over a much wider area than what we're seeing right now, and I just don't see it happening.
I think we might have to keep our eye on authoritarians who might impose a degree of control on us that's essentially equivalent to martial law, but then just say, hey, it's not martial law. They're not calling it martial law. So that's what I was getting at, that it doesn't seem to be a clear line between, the National Guard and telling us like we can't go out at 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I mean, what martial laws, we can't go out at 2 in the afternoon or 24 hours a day? I don't know.
What's interesting is the scale of this. I mean, Mike had asked, has this happened before? Well, of course, this has happened before in U.S. history, but it's been isolated. You had riots in New York City fighting the draft during the Civil War. San Francisco, post gold rush era, had basically become, there was no established law, but mob law for a long time. And in fact, when Tecumseh Sherman was posted out there, after he was posted and had gone back as a civilian, he was a banker, he was asked to head the National Guard. And he couldn't do anything because the citizenry had stolen all the weapons. So this stuff has happened before in our history. But what's amazing to me is to watch the scale. And it's happening in so many cities. And I think that's largely because of the information technology that exists today, the ability to communicate, plan, and carry out operations across many states and locales. But yeah, this has happened before, Mike. As I mentioned earlier, I'm an adherent to the concept of the fourth turning. And so every 85 years, we have a full cycle change. And we had this before, 85 years ago. Our country was in economic stagnation and the world was on the verge of total war. 85 years before that, the American Civil War. You might recall the loggerheads politically between the Whigs and the Democrats, which did culminate in a civil war. 85 years before that, the American Revolution. And we've just started down this last turning, and I'm expecting things to get much, much worse.
Right. I want to apologize to our audience and explain a little bit that it's difficult for me to constantly be watching the comments while we're talking. And so by the time I take a look, there may be a time lag. And also, if you folks aren't specific, I'm not necessarily going to be able to figure out what you're referring to. So Jennifer was disturbed by some video, but I don't know what. Let's just say I'm prepared to speak to you, Jennifer, in a most soothing way, so you're not disturbed. There's somebody's dog is disturbed too, and Amber is asking where this was. I'm not sure which video that refers to. Let me see if I can remember with the people standing in front of the cop cars. That was Brooklyn. The National Guard shooting the paintballs. I believe that was a suburb of Minneapolis. And the other one with the guy climbing on the armored vehicle, I don't know where that one was. Whose dog was that? I want names.
I think it's Don's dog.
Yeah, it's mine. That's why I was muting myself for a few minutes there. I have dinner being delivered, and they're upset that somebody's at the front door to do that.
All right, we got somebody named Alonzo, but he's muted his microphone. Alonzo, if you can hear me, the only way you can participate is if you unmute the microphone. Alonzo. Okay, Alonzo.
I think Alonzo is my brother, but he doesn't have Facebook, so I just gave him the direct link so he can watch.
Oh, okay. But
Jeff, I'd be curious to ask Don, in that last video with the two police cruisers, pushing, what are the legal issues that they're facing driving into a crowd like that? If let's just say someone were injured or killed in that, what are they liable for? Or would they simply chalk it off to they were with self-defense? Or what would be how would you maneuver that through our legal system?
So there's a lot to unpack there. Certainly there would be civil liability, I think, for the police department, probably not the officers individually. If somebody was injured, they would almost certainly sue the department and get some sort of a settlement that would cover their medical bills. Officer safety comes first. I think any cop or police supervisor on up to chiefs would tell you that. As I mentioned before, when we were looking at people trying to block CHP vehicles on California freeways and the police cars driving off and getting out of there, the police don't have any obligation to put themselves in danger. It's sort of a misconception that I think we call them heroes because they do volunteer to go do that. There's no requirement for them to put themselves in danger. What are they going to do? Stop and get out of the car so that people can beat the shit out of them? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. They're going to do what they need to do to protect themselves and go home to their families at night. And if that means that they're going to run over somebody who's trying to stop their car, they're going to do it in the gentlest way they can. But I don't see anything criminal about that. They've got as much a right to go home that night as anybody else.
Right, Don. And so to that point, my next question would be to what extent does the government have an obligation to enforce law and order? How long can such chaos be allowed to go on? And then I guess my second comment to that would be, how long before, the right-wing nut jobs start organizing militias and getting into the fray? Because if you have a chaotic situation like this, already a lot of property has been destroyed. How are you going to settle liability cases? How are you going to charge criminal cases? People have been killed. People have already lost their lives. So how long can we as Americans allow this to go on before we demand that the government put a stop to this?
That's a political question, not a legal question.
Well, I mean, but in the political, more neutral political way, what is the legal obligation of local or state governments to maintain law and order? Because, like, even Jeff said, he can't go to the store because all the stores have been destroyed in his area.
That's an interesting question. I mean, can somebody sue the city for failing to provide protection?
No, that's the short answer.
Give us a brief answer.
I mean, the government only exists and has rights to the extent that the citizenry allows that. Government, I mean, people forget that the government is here to serve the people, and I mean, we pay taxes and we expect some degree of safety, but it's there's no particular government actor who has an obligation to stick their nose in the middle of something that's going to be dangerous for them, and we can't reasonably expect them to. So they come in, wearing protective gear and doing everything they can to protect themselves, and they do put themselves in that harm's way. I think that's part of why in these situations the National Guard gets called in, because those people have taken a bit of a different oath. They've agreed to put their lives on the line for American political interests, which is a lot different than what a police have agreed to do. But still, National Guard shouldn't be expected to be killed on our streets. So it really is a delicate question. And if somebody is taking up arms, in terms of Mike's question, as right-wingers taking up arms to try to protect society, I think that's just going to lead to more violence and be problematic, and we're going to have problems there too. So I think that's going to lead to less safety and security, not more. Everybody, what really needs to happen is everybody needs to take a deep breath and take a step back and say, maybe enough is enough here. And, let's see if there's change. What they want is change in society. They want people to be treated better. They want everybody to be treated the same. Well, that's not going to happen tomorrow because of your protest tonight. So I support your right to go out and make a statement and, make a big statement, make a big deal out of it, get everybody's attention and say, hey, this isn't right. We can talk about line drawing as to where the line is as far as how big that statement can be. But, ultimately, you're going to have to settle all this down and take a step back and see if it keeps happening. The problem that got us to where we are is it's continued to happen. Over decades, there are people continuing to be mistreated by our police. And if you look at the statistics, it appears to be, that it's not racially equal.
I think there is a huge insurance aspect to this story that's underexplored. And I actually asked my insurance broker to come on for an interview sometime this week, so hopefully he'll do that. And what I'm getting at is that I know some of these smaller businesses don't even have insurance, but I think most of them do, certainly the bigger ones. And their attitude is, well, if the whole place gets wiped out, insurance will just pay for it. And I understand that, but I also know reality, and that can't please the insurance companies. So what I would like to get some clarity on, if I can, from somebody, is what sort of pressure can the insurance companies exert? Because they're a huge industry and they're very politically connected. What is their position going to be about, when these huge stores have their entire inventory wiped out, everything is destroyed, and they write a huge check, and then it's like, well, now the store wants to stay insured and get back into business, and the insurance company is going to go, oh, sure, pay the same premiums, we'll just keep paying it out. I don't think that's going to happen. Have you guys seen anybody in the news address this aspect of the story?
I have not seen anybody in the news address it, but I certainly have privately amongst friends had conversations about these small businesses and their insurance policies that will pay out. Somebody I was talking to was saying that they would go target the whitest businesses they could in terms of I guess some people have been targeting like Louis Vuitton stores in Beverly Hills and up in Oregon. And somebody I was talking to said, yeah, I'd go bash out windows at a Hummer dealership because they perceive that to be the whitest thing that they could, take out their vengeance on. And I said, well, you're hurting the insurance companies, right? I mean, You're not going in there saying, I'm going to avenge my anger on travelers because they're the big insurance company. I mean, because ultimately that's who is going to be left holding the bag. Now, some insurance policies do have civil unrest exclusions where they won't cover this kind of thing. So it's something for a business owner to be aware of. If they think they're in an area where that might be a problem, they want to get a policy that's actually going to cover that, and they're probably going to pay more for it. And to your point, Jeff, yeah, the insurance companies, may very well pay out on a lot of these claims, and that's going to result in rates going up, and then the business owners are going to have to pay more. So, I mean, that's the way insurance companies work, right? You have people, millions of businesses across the country paying into these insurance policies. And now you have little pockets of places where people are going to cash in their policies. But the companies have collected from people in all the other areas where there is no unrest. And, that's how insurance works. It's socialism in action. They take the money from everybody, pay off the few claims, and it works.
So if a business has a policy that excludes civil unrest, it would seem to me very much worth it to these types of businesses to hire armed guards, private security, and whatever the cost of that is, it's going to be way less than having their entire inventory wiped out and having the store destroyed. But I don't see much of that going on.
That may be true right up until the point where one of those guards is killed and then the business gets sued over that.
Yeah, there's liability every way you turn.
Now, I will say this. I did get a letter from my insurer, the Hartford. I have a few employees, a couple businesses, and they added terrorism insurance to my policy. I didn't ask them to. It's going to cost me an extra $149 a year, but maybe that's all part of this. So.
And that's for what? Insuring what?
Just if there's
I don't mean behavior. What type of insurance are you talking about?
I'm talking business overall liability.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So on a similar note, there's been a lot of talk over the last several weeks about business interruption insurance, which is included in a lot of business policies. And from what I see, actually, the Hartford is one that has written the policy in such a way that it won't cover for pandemic business interruption, but there are many companies that will end up paying out for business interruptions due to the coronavirus pandemic. But we're getting a bit off topic.
Yeah. But it is interesting. Go back historically, looking at the merchant classes. They always, you talked to, recently Nassim Taleb, the author of Black Swan, was talking about just this point where they manage these risks. They manage the risks of a loss of a ship. They managed the risks of quarantines. So they kept enough cash on hand to say, wow, in Genoa, we may lose operations for a month. And this was actually figured into the cost of doing business, into the goods and everything. So maybe going forward into this time where, you look at what's going on now and then look at more macro things. Like, for instance, NASA believes and others that we're entering a grand solar minimum. That's going to have a significant impact on harvests and the productivity of our crops. And so there are a lot of things that are going to start playing out that will increase risk and the cost of doing business. So I would expect that insurance, maybe, frankly, Jeff, I think you're onto something. I think insurers are going to want to get more involved in their legislatures and making sure that they can control risk as much as possible.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. So Don and I were planning to also talk about the dispute between Trump and Twitter, and it's actually related to this unrest because it was about the civil unrest that Trump tweeted, and then Twitter scolded him for it, and they kind of semi-censored him by attaching a warning to the tweet and diminishing the visibility and diminishing the ability for others to comment on it. And Trump responded by issuing an executive order. And before we get into the legality of it, let me just see if this is actually the second tweet. The first tweet, Trump said something about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and they attached their warning saying that glorified violence, which I thought was a a very weak claim. And this is even worse, because here Trump, who's the president of the United States, you might remember, is simply taking the position that it might be necessary to call in the National Guard. I mean, what could, out of all the things he has said, that is one of the mildest. So, I mean, let's just take a look at exactly his words so nobody gets the impression I'm sugarcoating it. I can't stand back and watch this happen to a great American city, Minneapolis, a total lack of leadership. Either way, the very weak radical left mayor, Jacob Frey, get his act together and bring the city under control, or I will send in the National Guard and get the job done right. So it's obviously those last few words that Twitter is characterizing as glorifying violence, and that is a violation of their ridiculous rules. So I don't blame Trump or anybody who's a reasonable person for being outraged by this, because how's anybody going to communicate with each other and have normal debate and discussion if something that milquetoast is regarded as unacceptable? I can't even believe this is being censored or semi-censored.
While you were saying that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to talk over you. Go ahead.
No, so before we get into the executive order, how about let's just pause and comment, each of you, on that tweet and the idea that it's somehow beyond the pale, according to Twitter.
Okay, because I love to read history. When you were reading that, all I could think about was Abraham Lincoln's comment to Harriet Tubman when he finally met her, because he goes, oh, she was the abolitionist who wrote, what was the name of the book about the escaped slave? Oh, gosh, it'll come to me. But he goes, oh, so you're the little lady who started it all. And that took a whole novel, okay? Now we can do that in 142 characters. I mean, it's pretty amazing what we've done with information technology over the years. So that's my reaction, how powerful now one phrase from the right person can be and can shape the entire political dialogue. It's, to me, that's the amazing thing. But in terms of why is that censored? I mean, you're talking to someone who has a whole page. The Southern Poverty Law Center has devoted an entire page to me. So, and it's all lies, but it's all there. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the world we live in. There's attempts to censor free speech and what doesn't fit the narrative. And I think this is an example of it.
Okay, who's next, Don or Mike? Let's go in alphabetical order.
Well, there's nothing violent about that tweet, I would think. I'm not sure why they attached the tag there.
Yeah.
But I think, as a broader issue, these are private companies, and, I'm not sure, the government now wants to censor the censorship. And again, is it violence on violence? I mean, is that appropriate? I don't, it's.
Yeah, well,
I disagree with Twitter politics to begin with. I think the tweeter in chief shouldn't be announcing domestic or foreign policy through that type of forum. But I also think that,
well, as usual, your anti-Trump bias is preventing you from having appropriate outrage. You're outraged about a one National Guard incident, but
I would be equally outraged if anybody else, any other government official, was announcing policy via Twitter.
Yeah, but we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about censorship. And it's not just a private company. This is a private company that has special protection. They have been given an exemption from the Communication Decency Act that shields them from liability in the area of libel. So they have the best of both worlds. They're treated like they're a telephone company, meaning the phone company isn't responsible for what people say to each other on the phone. But unlike the telephone company, they're interfering with what people are saying, and they shouldn't have it both ways. Thank
Well,
you. And
you're correct that Section 230, that's 47 U.S.C. 230, does provide some protection for these online forums who are just passing through what other people say. And that's probably appropriate. And I think that there is a line with, as they start to become more and more involved in what people can say, and they also have protection for things that they might censor. Because the government is worried about things like child pornography or things like that, and we want Twitter to be able to take those things down without the original poster being able to sue them and subjecting them to liability for that.
yeah,
So, I mean, it's another question of line drawing as to where the censorship line is drawn. I mean, they have
Right.
algorithms that determine what I see. I see more of your stuff than I do one of my high school friends because Facebook realizes that we're doing this together and that we interact a lot. So it shows me more of your stuff. Is that a form of censorship that, maybe it hides some stuff from me and doesn't hide others? It's a question of, how they determine that. Are they going to choose to show me all libertarian?
We're talking about viewpoint-based. We're talking about viewpoint-based censorship. Okay, so these algorithms that you're referring to are not based on viewpoint. So I don't think it would be
algorithms. How do you know that? How do you know if Facebook doesn't choose?
The example you just gave. Yeah, you're right. It could be programmed in such a way that it's motivated based on viewpoint. You're right, but the example you just gave wasn't. And by the way, I don't want the government. I don't want social media companies to be liable. However, it's a weapon. It's a threat Trump is making. War has been declared. So hopefully the outcome won't be that, there's just more censorship. But I'm all in favor of him waging war. But let's look at what I think might be the key part of Trump's executive order, which says that subparagraph C2 expressly addresses protections from civil liability and specifies that an interactive computer service provider may not be made liable on account of its decision in good faith to restrict access to content that it considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whatever that means. It is the policy of the United States to ensure that, to the maximum extent permissible under the law, this provision is not distorted to provide liability protection. So I think the potential battle here is over how good faith is interpreted. You think Trump has any legal argument there, or the government?
Good faith and otherwise objectionable. I think the issue that Trump is going to have here is that this was passed by the legislature. Laws are passed by the legislature. Now he's trying to amend that or limit it by executive order, and he's going to run into a problem with doing that if he actually wants to take any action based on his executive order. I mean, right now, the order says, I want federal agencies to look into things. I want them to give me a report on XYZ. I want them to look at their budgets for advertising and see what percentage is going to these companies. And I want to make sure that we're doing this, correctly. Okay, Yep. It's a shot across the bow. But to the extent that he's going to try to enforce anything or have DOJ, actually take action, he's going to have a hard time doing that with an executive order. And I looked at a draft of this before the final version, and there were some significant changes along those lines. I'm actually glad to see that it got watered down a bit.
Well, you're right that you're right to highlight the distinction between changing legislation and interpreting law, but the federal government can interpret law, and that's why I think it comes down to how do you interpret good faith. That's not amending legislation to go into court and argue that such and such a policy was not done in good faith. I mean, I don't know whether he would win with that, but that's not violating the authority of, the separation of powers.
And Twitter says, in good faith, we found this otherwise objectionable. And you're going to expect somebody to to sort that out. I mean, what probably needs to happen, if there's a critical mass of people who believe that policy or that legislation is a problem in the way that's being applied, then you need to go to the legislature and have that changed.
Yeah.
But
Well,
but Don had called them, these are private companies. Isn't that part of the problem, gentlemen? Shouldn't they be utilities that should be regulated like utilities, like public utilities? Why? I mean, we've invested a great deal of power in these private companies. Oh, and one real quick thing. I got the author wrong. It was Harriet Beecher Stowe, not Harriet Tubman, was the author from the Civil War. But I'm curious.
Thank you for clarifying that. I don't think these companies should be considered to be public utilities. I think I'm on the fence as to whether the government should or could create its own competitor social media platform and host it, and
BBC
maybe have a degree of control. But these are private companies. There's a free market. If people don't like the way that Twitter or Facebook or any other company is managing it, leave. There are lots of other social media platforms out there. Some are more successful than others, and people can start their own if they want to. There's nothing that compels anybody to use Twitter. And I think that's where the analogy to a public utility falls apart also. That, I basically have to use gas and electricity and water. I don't have much of a choice in modern society. I have several friends who refuse to be on any kind of social media, and they're going about their lives doing just fine. I know a lot of people who are not on Facebook, and it bothers me because I don't get to keep tabs on what they're doing, and I don't get updates on their kids and what's happening, and I feel out of touch with them. But that's a choice that they've made, and they're doing just fine for it.
Plus, companies like Twitter and all these social media companies are one huge step removed from anything analogous to what we've previously called utilities. What would be more analogous would be internet providers, the ones that provide internet service. But if Twitter and Facebook is considered a utility, then couldn't anybody who establishes a website fit the definition of a utility? Right? I mean, I know they're big. Part I don't dispute, but anybody theoretically can get big or semi-big, and it seems very difficult to make that distinction.
But we've seen really from the dawn of the .com era, there is a certain first mover advantage that these companies have been able to take advantage of. And in a way, these are very much commons. And as commons, shouldn't they be regulated for the quote unquote public good?
Yeah,
I mean, the Supreme Court, in Pruneyard and in other recent decisions, has said that it is the public square, and that that really they should be free from regulation. I mean, they really are treated more like media. The New York Times, they're going to face the same type of regulation that the New York Times would. The problem then is that the New York Times is liable for things like libel and defamation. And that applies to different standards depending on who the target is and how much research that they have to do to make sure that what they're saying is true. There are all sorts of very complicated legal standards there. The difference with things like Facebook and Twitter is you have any Joe Blow with a smartphone can post almost anything. And you don't want to hold Twitter accountable for every falsehood. If I say, my neighbor's a bitch, you don't want Twitter to be held liable for that because I put that on there. My neighbor shouldn't be able to sue Twitter. My neighbor should sue me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, as I was saying before, Trump is playing hardball. And as I was saying before, the outcome when we were talking about, I don't even think is the outcome he wants. But he uses the leverage that he has available to him, and that's the particular threat he's making. But he's also basically sending out notice that they're going to look for any possible way to make make their lives difficult. And some of it would be quite legitimate. Like he's saying, we're going to enforce laws on deceptive advertising and fraud and so forth and so on. There's a zillion laws on the book. And, some of that would be quite legitimate to enforce. And I think that's really what Trump's move is all about. We shouldn't focus on any one particular outcome. I think the goal is to get them to stop playing favorites.
Well, another piece of this that's fascinating is you have a president who came into office saying that they're going to slash a lot of regulations and get rid of a lot of things, and now here he is directing his agencies to go create more regulations.
Well, that's a little ironic, but it's not exactly hypocritical, because there's a pretty good reason to make an exception here.
That's
they're going after him. Remember, you saw the tweet I showed a couple of minutes ago, because he said we might need to call the National Guard. The president can't say that. Come on, get out.
If they took it down, I would have a huge problem. Attaching a tag to it, and that particular tweet, I don't think there was even anything violent about it. But they didn't take it down.
Everybody was expressing support for the protesters. That is so obviously much more glorifying violence, or at the very least equivalent. I mean, this is absurd. You can't say that I want the police to take. I mean, the Nazi. This is just some saying they want the law enforced. That's glorifying violence.
Exactly. And can we stop calling them protesters and call them what they are? Terrorists.
I think that there's a mix of both out there. I think that at the core, there are protesters who have a legitimate gripe and should be out there protesting. And then I think that there are mixed in amongst them people who wish to do a greater degree of harm, whose motivations are not necessarily aligned with the legitimate protesters. So it's a tough situation. Certainly there are people there who are protesters, and there are also people there who stronger terms would be appropriate.
But I will say, going back, to what I used to do for work in the 1980s, when we were fighting terrorism across the globe, and we were going after PFLPGC, Baader-Meinhof Gang, Red Army faction, Abu Nidal, Sendero Luminoso, one of the things that came out of by the mid 1980s is, never call a group terrorists or freedom fighters, things like that. What they are is they're breaking the law, and perhaps you might have to use paramilitary means to go after them. But what you don't want to do is validate their cause. You treat them like the common criminals they are, and then when you arrest them, you try them by the laws of the land. So that's my one issue with, calling them terrorists. I'd rather let's just look. These are people that have injured people. These are people that have destroyed property. These are people that have colluded to do all the above and conspired to do all the above. Let's just arrest them under those laws. It'll be much more expeditious, I think, through getting them through the courts.
Well, I don't think that logic applies to this situation, because in this context, the problem we have is that their behavior is being sugarcoated. So we need to counter that. And by just referring to them as common criminals, I don't think is going to do the job. And I really don't think that in this situation, calling them terrorists is making anybody think they have a legitimate cause.
One man is, what is it? Yasser Arafat said, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That is my issue with this. Again, it's one of the things that our government learned right up until 9/11, when we threw everything we knew about combating terrorism out the window and started this thing called the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism. So to me, the most legitimate, the most effective thing we can do is cite them for the laws that they're breaking and try them under the judicial system that we have. The laws are in place.
All right. Mike, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, my question would be, what is their cause? And if they are protesters, what are their demands? To my mind, if you're protesting something, you have to have a clear demand. This is the same thing that happened with Occupy Wall Street. It's a bunch of hippies got on Wall Street and they just said, we don't like things the way they are. Okay, a lot of people don't like things the way they are. But what do you want to happen? Why are you out there? It's not organized. And this is like they're destroying property. People are dying. They're setting cities on fire. And maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion, but I'm not looking at the media representation of this. I'm looking at cell phone videos and things people are recording on the street. And it blows my mind. In my heart, as an American citizen, I'm literally hurt to see what's happening to my country. And people are like, oh, these are protesters. Oh, this and that. Oh, how do we do this? Like, we need to stop this. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, they're bad protesters. The gold standard, I think, was the Montgomery bus boycott when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. And what was perfect about that was that the objection was very clear. There were still some racist people who maybe weren't on board, but everybody understood what the injustice or the claimed injustice was. The demand was very clear, which was let black people have the same privileges on the bus as everyone else. And if the demand was met, that would end the boycott. And the other thing that was perfect about it is they targeted the culprits. They didn't start bothering people who were in the neighborhood like Wall Street or, who are vaguely associated. They went after the culprits and only the culprits. Now, I'm not saying every protest has to be as perfect as that, but that's a good frame of reference. You compare that to the protests nowadays, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or any of the Black Lives Matter stuff, and it's vague at best. Yeah, there's police brutality and there's racism, but what's your specific point right now at this time? There's a lot of societal problems.
Yeah. But Jeff, one of the things that I've seen with protests that originate from the left, and you recall what it was like in Los Angeles during the Second Gulf War protests, and I was in probably most of them. If you were a casual observer walking by, you probably wouldn't know what that protest is about, because way up front you might see Veterans for Peace, but then you have, Get Us Out of Palestine, all these just a balkanization of political causes. And you don't know really what the whole thing is about. And that is one of the problems with the left. I saw an amazing thing on Saturday at the local Black Lives Matter protest. The mic and everything was being controlled by a group of black protesters. And one white guy got his way to the mic and started to speak. And it was great because this one black activist is like, hey, you get out of there. Pass the mic to a black person. This is about black people. And I thought that was awesome. It's like they're not going to allow this movement, that particular protest, to get hijacked with people that might have other motives that probably don't get what they're about.
This, Don, we didn't get into it too deeply, but this was kind of what I was thinking. Remember in our last episode, and I asked, well, is it getting better or is it getting worse with respect to the police abusing African Americans? And you said, well, they have a long way to go because the starting point was slavery. So, but what I was getting at, Don, was why now? In other words, there's a lot of societal problems. I think that the average American who wants to watch a football game, there's nothing wrong with them wondering, well, we don't normally have protests and sporting events. What's going on right now? Has it gotten worse lately? Which states in the country or cities is this bad? There's no specific demand. It's just, it's absurd. They're just bad at protesting.
Well, the data is certainly out there if you care to look for the research as to, which police departments are more egregious than others. And I think I sent you a chart recently that demonstrated that there are, I think what we found was that there are more white people who are killed by police than black people, But if you adjust that for population numbers, it's absurdly weighted toward, black people being, killed by police at a much higher rate than white people. And that, it has to do with, policing choices in various communities. It has to do with police training, and it has to do with sometimes, unfortunately, it has to do with the type of person who wants to become a police officer in some cases. And that's, so I mean, it's a multifaceted problem. And certainly, the demands of these protesters, sure, they're vague because it's a vague issue. And yeah, we're making progress, right? There's less police brutality and fewer problems than there were 20 years ago.
And then we have body cams, and that helps.
I think body cams help to an extent, but I've also seen studies where the body cams alone don't really help. I mean, you would hope that people would be on better behavior, but as a defense attorney, I see a lot of body cam and I see a lot of things that are done wrong. I consider that to be a crucial function of my job, is to review body camera footage, find mistakes, and exploit them to my client's advantage.
Yeah, but I think, Jeff, like you said, are things getting better? And I mean, when you look at the American descendants of slaves, and I'm not like talking the black community, we're looking at people who can go back to the 1700s here in this country. Things have not gotten better for them as a group. Actually, they've gotten worse. When you look at how immigrants have come to this country, there's always this upward, there's, time on the bottom, time to struggle, but eventually that upward trajectory. The American descendants of slaves have not realized this as a group. There are exceptions, of course, but as a group, they have not. And I think they've become this permanent underclass, and we as a country need to address that. And unfortunately, that gets watered down with all these other groups that are looking to ride the civil rights train and do something for their in-group, as opposed to saying, no, we all need to focus on this one particular group of people and ask ourselves why it's not working and what we need to do to make it work for them.
Yeah. Well, it's about being effective communicators. That is a requirement. You want to influence public opinion and you have to be good at communicating with people. So, Don, you can tell us to go do research and try to interpret statistics, but the average person isn't going to do that. And they're probably not even capable of sorting it all out. So, people who care about an issue, if they're serious, they should also take seriously their obligation to communicate clearly and keep Rosa Parks in mind as a sort of a guidepost in terms of being clear and making us, like Mike said, you got to make a specific demand so that people know what they're working towards. Colin Kaepernick and his NFL buddies are saying, well, we're going to kneel probably for the next 2 seasons, maybe forever, maybe 3 seasons. What's going to end it? And I guarantee you right now, 99.9% of the population couldn't tell you what the Black Lives Matter suggestion is, whether you call it a demand or a suggestion. This has the whole nation's interest right now. Can you guys honestly tell me that anybody knows anything specific that they want? Specific, I mean.
Reparations is certainly one of the things in the mix for Black Lives Matter.
How much reparations?
We have to work that through. But and the thing is, we have to work through whether. No, actually, we have government, we have leaders, civic leaders, and I think we need to come up with a formula, something that will, on our it's like any plan. You measure twice, you cut once. Maybe do a small program, see how that works. See, do we want to give people money so that it goes into some car dealer's pocket or some in the
I don't think.
Or do we do training? There's things, but ultimately, what I'm getting at is certain things aren't being addressed. That's obvious. And to your point, Jeff, I don't think these protests are really helping that because there's so many other agendas being foisted upon us. It has really very little to do with the death that happened.
Yeah. Well, there is no even central agenda except in a very vague way.
No, it's all vague, and I think that's where you can hide a lot of things. It's why the whole hope campaign in 2008. Hope is a nebulous. What does that mean? I mean, it's like, you tell your kid when you go out, be safe, as opposed to, hey, when you pull up to an intersection, don't turn the wheels of the car to the left until you get the green arrow. That way, if you're hit from behind, you don't get pushed into oncoming traffic. So that's something very specific, like what you're talking about, as opposed to something nebulous, like, well, be safe out there, Stop the hate.
All right, 35 minutes to go to the store, and if I'm not home by then the National Guard might shoot me with paintballs. Or if I'm lucky, the Long Beach police will just throw me in a regular jail. So I think we have to wind it up.
3 hots in a cot. Good for you.
Either that or I just don't go out and I try to find something to eat. I don't know. But this is life in America now. And anyway, anything else any of you nice gentlemen want to say? And please just leave me a little time to either eat and escape punishment.
I just want to thank you guys for this talk, and forgive me if I was a little bit aggressive at times. That's my nature.
I think you're
thank you very much for having
the one in the group.
Don and I have been doing this for a few weeks, and this is the first time we got anybody to join us by webcam. So I hope I handled it okay. It's hard to know who to bring in when, but in any case, I'm glad that we had our first experience. We could hear you, we could see you, and that part was
a lot of fun. Thanks, Jeff, Don, Mike. This was a lot of fun for me. I love talking politics. So.
All right. Well, great.
Let's see if we can get some more diversity in our involvement.
Yeah, we're 4 white guys.
Yeah, there you go.
Believe me, I did that an irony. That irony didn't escape me as I was pontificating about Black Lives Matters. But diversity, especially women. We love women. All right.
We do have some ideological diversity here, which I believe to be more important than outward traits diversity. But yeah.
Now, you do know the one good thing about a curfew in dating. I lived in a country that still had a curfew for a while, and when you looked at the watch, like, oh my God, you'll never make it home by curfew. I think you might want to think about staying the night.
That's like, baby, it's cold outside.
Baby, it's cold out. Baby, they're armed with M16s outside. You don't want to go. You don't want to run a roadblock out there.
Wow. On that note, I think we're done today.
All right, guys. Take it easy. Stay out of jail. Watch those paintballs. And God bless America and Warsaw, Poland.
Right on.